Welcome to Law at the Margins webinar on dismantling juvenile prisons. My name is Shamtoli Haq. I'm the editor and attorney at lawatthemargins.com. Law at the Margins is an interdisciplinary collaborative platform that brings together lawyers, organizers, scholars, and policymakers, all committed to social justice. Today, we are excited to have a panel discussion on dismantling youth prisons. Before I sort of introduce our panelists, I just want to direct our participants' attention to lawatthemargins.com, where there is a wonderful piece by youth leaders in South Bronx, namely Devontae Lewis from Community Connections for Youth, that put together a participatory action research report. This is the voice of young people on how the juvenile justice system should be constructed. And I encourage you all to look at that piece at lawatthemargins.com. Also, please support our programs because by supporting the programs, we're able to really host these wonderful conversations. So today, we have our panelist with us is author and journalist Nell Bernstein. Later in the broadcast, we'll be joined by Mishi Faruqee, who is the National Field Director for Youth First Initiatives. Nell is an author of the book Burning Down the House. And in fact, reading the book was the impetus for this webinar. And there she puts forth a provocative, yet I think a very truth-telling proposal that we need to shut down our nation's brutal and counterproductive juvenile prisons and bring our children home. She's a former Soros Justice Media Fellow and a winner of the White House Champion of Change Award. Her articles have appeared in Newsday, Salon, Mother Jones, and Washington Post. I'll give Mishi's bio. Mishi is the National Field Director for Youth First. She has an extensive experience on the field of juvenile justice, working with the National ACLU, the Washington ACLU. She served as the Director of Youth at the Children's Defense Fund. She's been the Policy Senior Advisor to the Commissioner at the New York City Department of Probation and also at the Correctional Association. What we will do today is invite Nell and then Mishi to give some preliminary remarks. Those who are watching, you can use the chat feature to comment. We know that we have a number of folks who are also engaged around juvenile justice, so I ask you to share your thoughts as well. So with that, I'm going to invite Nell to begin us out with a little bit of background on juvenile prisons, sort of the basis and the case for why we need to close the prisons down. So Nell, thank you so much for joining us.
I'm very glad to be here. Among the reasons that I came to the conclusion that we need to shut down the juvenile prison is the history of that institution. And I think there's a story that we tell ourselves about that history, that we once had a golden era in which we had genuinely rehabilitative institutions, and over time those were corrupted to become the abusive prisons that they are today. And as I began to look into the history of the juvenile prison under whatever name, I found that just wasn't true. The very first house of refuge in New York was plagued by abuses not so different from those that we see today. And very soon after the institution was introduced, we started having scandals and inquiries and investigations and finding not only neglect and abuse and overcrowding and sort of dreadful conditions, but the use of a really terribly imaginative array of punishments to keep the kids in line. Swabbing comes to mind. They would fill a basement half full with water and give the kids burlap sacks to mop the water up with, and until they had completed that task, they couldn't eat or rest. So as I kind of followed the trajectory of juvenile justice, what I saw was mini cycles of scandal, recrimination, reform, repeat. So I started thinking about what is it about this institution that makes it so irredeemable, so beyond rehabilitation, because we've been trying to rehabilitate the institution ever since we invented it. And now is an interesting time in that conversation, because when I started writing the book, we were already in the middle of a movement away from these institutions. The total population of young people kept in them had dropped 40% over 10 years. Now the number of kids in juvenile prisons has dropped 50% from its high in the 1990s. So I've been thinking about that. What does that mean? Is the cup half empty or half full? And I guess the conclusion I've reached is that if the cup contains poison, it really doesn't matter. If we continue to administer something to children that's detrimental to them, a 50% drop in the dosage, it's a good thing, but it's not time to throw the celebration yet. And just to explain a little more clearly how I became so convinced that this was intrinsically a damaging intervention, I usually try to stay away from statistics. My book is mostly grounded in stories that children told me, but there's one stat that, as a parent of 2 teenagers myself, really got to me. The percentage of adolescents who acknowledge having committed acts that are not only illegal but serious enough that under the law they could lead to incarceration is around 90%. So 90% of all adolescents are eligible for incarceration. And I know that sounds high, but I think if we think about some of the things that we incarcerate kids for and think about our own adolescence, it starts to make a little more sense. We incarcerate a lot of kids, but not 90%. And which route you end up taking is just about entirely determined by race and by class. So if 90% of kids are committing delinquent acts, to me that says there's no such thing as a juvenile delinquent. That's not a kind of kid. It's a developmental phase. And the kids who are allowed to work their way through that developmental phase tend to just grow up and grow out of it. And those tend to be better off white kids. The kids who are steered into juvenile halls and then juvenile prisons not only have their development kind of stalled at that moment, but experience the isolation of trauma as well as consistently high levels of physical and sexual abuse that leave them further traumatized and make it twice as likely that a kid who's incarcerated, controlling for everything, including the offense, as a juvenile, is going to go on to be incarcerated as an adult. So, just what that tells me is that we've got a false dichotomy going when we talk about being good to kids and public safety as opposite poles. It turns out that doing what's right for kids actually enhances public safety. And that's why I did come to believe that the juvenile prison, its time has more than come and gone.
Your cases of the stories. I think the stories are very impactful from your book. And the other piece that I think that what really convinced me was that the origins of the prisons and the notion of the best interest of the child, coming also into family court, and so that it's not just prisons, but the entire legal structure actually has this carceral mentality, and I think you do a really good job of sort of laying the framework of that. And I was wondering, for those who may not have read your book, but they can get the book at New Press, can share a little bit about that. We're also joined by Mishi. So after Nell sort of poses this question, I'm going to invite Mishi for her remarks. And for those of you who are online chatting, you please continue to chat, pose your questions, and then I will also begin to invite you to pose questions to our panelists directly. So Nell, if you could share some stories and then speak a little bit about the concept of best interest of the child, which actually has been used, it sounds like, to not to be in the best interest of the child.
Well, you've brought up a tremendously important point when you talk about conflating child welfare and juvenile justice. Originally, the first institutions made no distinction between a child who was removed from his family and institutionalized for being delinquent or for being neglected or for being destitute. There was no requirement of due process. The helping societies could go out into poor neighborhoods and literally round up immigrant kids who they thought would do better off in institutions. And it's funny, I started my interest in this and my professional life right out of college as a counselor in a group home. And from day one, I saw the criminalization of kids whom I had understood to be there for their own protection. We had a padlock on the refrigerator. If the kids left the house without permission, they were AWOL, and we would call the police. So that line is kind of always already crossed between child protection and rehabilitation. And you're right, the legal basis for both is the best interest of the child. But I think that the more important thing that links those two systems is who determines the best interest of the child. The early houses of refuge and similar institutions really were the first time that control over the child was shifted from the family to the state. And once that shift has been made, once we take for granted that for some kids, the state is going to determine what's in their best interest, for those of you who are parents, that's profound. If somebody told me that somebody other than me was in charge of deciding what was in my children's best interest, I'd go berserk. But we sort of take that for granted above and beyond the things that happen that are so profoundly counter to children's best interest. You wanted a story. I hardly know where to begin when I think about stories that kids told me of actions that were taken that were just so profoundly counter to their best interest. The use of solitary confinement, which continues unabated despite the president's statement against it, and limits on its use in federal institutions. I think I read somewhere that those limits affect 27 kids. So whereas I don't think there was a kid I talked to who had not been placed in some form of isolation or solitary confinement. And they're talking about the best interest of the child. If you're suicidal, you get put in solitary confinement, even though rates of successful suicides and suicide attempts are much higher in solitary confinement. If you've been sexually abused inside the institution, you can be put in solitary for your own protection. So I think that's one among many examples of just the emptiness of the phrase "in the best interest of the child."
Great. I'd like to now invite Mishi to join us, who through Youth First initiative has actually launched a campaign to reduce and to end youth incarceration. So thank you, Mishi, for joining us, and tell us a little bit about kind of what you're seeing, national trends, and then certain policy initiatives that you'd like to kind of inform us.
Yeah, thanks so much, and I apologize for coming on late. I was having technical problems. But yeah, I'm so glad to be here with Chumtholi and with Nell to talk about this. As Chumtholi mentioned, Youth First is a new initiative, and our goal is to end youth incarceration and to close youth prisons. And so it's a big goal. The way that we're going about it is we're focusing on working in 15 states over the next 5 years. And our hope is that if we're able to close youth prisons in those states and dramatically reduce the number of young people who are incarcerated in those states, we could achieve a national tipping point where 15 states is like almost a third of states. If we could, in a third of states, if we could sort of really move the ball in those states, and we can have this tipping point where people sort of recognize that the failures of youth incarceration and and really focus on sort of a new system focused on community-based alternatives. And I call them alternatives. Our goal is to make them the norm rather than the alternative. And so, in terms of what's been happening with youth incarceration, the good news is there has been a really dramatic decrease in youth incarceration nationally. And so, over the last 15 years, it's dropped by half. So that's the good news. The bad news is that pretty much every state in the country still relies on youth prisons, and both for young people who are in the juvenile justice system as well as young people who are transferred into the adult system. And so in terms of policy initiatives, one of the things that we're focusing on is really looking at the fiscal architecture of youth incarceration. There's a lot of money within the prison system, within the youth prison system. Costs on average over $100,000 to incarcerate a young person in a youth prison. In some states, it's over, like in New York, for example, it's $350. The most expensive youth incarceration is $350,000 a year per child. So we're spending, millions and millions of dollars, actually $5 billion a year in youth incarceration. And so one of the policy initiatives that we've been promoting in states is how to create incentives for communities to be able to create community-based alternatives and to systematize that across the state so that communities will say, like, we'll reduce the number of kids we send to the state system, and then the state will provide an incentive to those communities, to those counties, to fund community-based alternatives. And so this kind of fiscal incentive program has worked in several states, and so we're promoting it in the states that we're working in. Right now, we're working intensively in 5 states: Kansas, West Virginia, New Jersey, Connecticut, and Virginia. And so in each of those states, there's been efforts to try to get funding for community-based alternatives. Some of the states actually have gone further, where the governors actually have called for closure of some youth prisons in those states. In Virginia, the governors called for the closure of 2 youth prisons, and in Connecticut, there's one big Connecticut training school, and the governor's called to close that youth prison. And so so there has been progress in these states, and really what the big thing right now is to really create the continuum in communities and to really have people understand that these community-based programs do work and that they can work for a whole range of kids. I think, a lot of times people think about, just diverting very low-level youth who committed very low-level offenses, what people call status offenses, which are youth who are only committed offense because of their status as a young person. And so things like running away, truancy, curfew violations. There are kids who are being incarcerated for that, and so a lot of states have made progress in reducing the number of status offenders who are incarcerated, but most states have just focused on these, low-level offenses, young people who commit those nonviolent offenses. But we really believe that that community-based programs really can work for all young people, including young people who've committed serious violent offenses, because it's not working for young people now. It's not working for anybody now. I mean, the recidivism rates for any young person who goes into these facilities is abysmal. It's most places it's more than 3/4 of young people who were released from youth prisons end up going back into the system. And so it's not working for anybody. And so we really feel like when we talk about ending the use of youth incarceration, we're talking about ending youth incarceration for young people across the board, not just for the young people who've committed low-level offenses. I'm sorry.
If you can share with us a little bit more about the states that have taken a positive direction towards reducing youth incarceration or exploring alternatives. Can you give us a little bit more data? I know that you've had some really interesting data about what those states are doing. And the other issue, and maybe Nell can speak to this after, is since there has been a drop in overall numbers of youth incarcerated, I mean, is this call to end or dismantle prisons, is it as urgent as it was, say, at an earlier time?
Sure. Yeah, so let me start with talking about what's happened in New York, because it's the state where I'm most familiar and I've been most involved. In 2000, before 2007, there were 31 youth prisons in New York State, and most of those prisons were located in upstate New York. Most of them, were very far from where the young people who were being sent to them were from, and so the majority of young people before 2007 being sent to the youth prisons were from New York City. Over 65% of the young people being sent to the state prisons. And most of these prisons were located outside of New York, some of them like on the Canadian border. So young people from New York City were traveling up to 8 hours. And it was very difficult for their families to maintain contact. Most young people, when they're sent to these state prisons, they're basically cut off from their families, cut off from their communities. And so, and these facilities had just horrific conditions of confinement and abuse inside the facilities. I started working on juvenile justice in New York in 2001, and we ran a program for young people who were coming out of the youth prison system, where we would train them to become advocates. And young people would talk about certain facilities. Particularly, there was one facility which was at the time, it's now called Finger Lakes. At the time, it was the Lou Gossett facility. It was named after the actor Lou Gossett. And used to call the facility Rugburn City, because the youth would be, the staff would do something called a face-down restraint, where if a young person acted out or talked back to staff or just basically didn't follow a rule or just didn't, get in line fast enough, the staff would restrain them, and they would restrain them, take them down with their face first, and so they would get rug burns on their faces. And so this was a regular occurrence, and not only rug burns, but kids would get dislocated shoulders, they would get broken bones, and so the Department of Justice started to investigate what was happening in New York. And in 2007, and there was no oversight, that was the other big issue, is that there was 31 facilities, but the Pataki administration had totally gutted oversight of the facilities, and so it was basically a black hole, and no one knew what was happening to these young people inside the facilities. And so there was one person, an ombudsman, who was responsible for overseeing 31 facilities. I mean, it was completely outrageous. This person, had no ability to go and visit what was go and monitor or, regularly inspect. And so he would get to each facility like every 2 years. And so then in 2007, Gladys Carrion became commissioner of the agency that ran the facilities, and it was completely a sea change when she became commissioner. And so she came in and said that these facilities are broken and the system is broken, and she recognized that one of the big reasons why there was so much resistance to closing these facilities and changing the system was because they were providing jobs to people in rural communities in upstate New York. And so people wanted these facilities just for that. I mean, for those jobs and for the employment and economic development that was bringing to these upstate towns. And so Gladys, when she became commissioner her first year, she immediately put together a plan to start closing these facilities. The other thing that was happening was the population had started to decrease because New York City had started creating some alternative incarceration programs. Upstate, and also Syracuse and Buffalo had also started creating alternative programs. So the population was decreasing. She wasn't able to actually close facilities right away because the unions had gotten a law passed that they had to give, the state had to give 1 year notice before they could close any facilities. And so there was actually some facilities that were completely empty, and staff were still reporting to work every day because the state couldn't close the facilities for 1 year. So you'd have these empty facilities, and staff would come report to work, and there would be nobody there. And so as advocates, I was running the Juvenile Justice Coalition at the time. We actually brought television cameras, and we got access because Gladys was commissioner, and so we actually filmed these empty facilities with a full complement of staff in the facilities. So the first year, she was able to close one. The second year, there was a Democratic turnover in the legislature, so the Democrats controlled both houses. And that year, she was actually able to close 8 facilities and downsize 3 others. And then this following year, she was able to close more. So by the time she left, she was able to actually close. She was commissioner from 2007 to 2014. And within those 7 years, she was able to close 21 youth prisons, which is just phenomenal. No other state has been able to close the number of youth prisons that New York State has done. And there was a lot of pushback. There was a lot of pushback from the legislators representing those, those rural towns that wanted the jobs. There was a lot of pushback from the unions that were representing the staff who worked in those facilities. And so the Juvenile Justice Coalition that I was running, a lot of different organizations got very involved in a statewide campaign to push for the closures. We called our campaign Empty Beds, Wasted Dollars, because there was so much money being spent on these facilities, and so many facilities were virtually empty, and so we did a whole sort of media campaign around that. And then the other thing that happened in 2012 was New York City passed legislation called Close to Home. And so that was another big milestone. I was actually working for the city at the time, and so I was part of the planning process for Close to Home. I worked with Vinnie Schiraldi on developing a plan for Close to Home. And so, and we worked with all the different other city agencies around this. But the idea with Close to Home was that before Close to Home legislation passed, once New York City youth went into court and they were convicted in court, they no longer were in the custody of New York City, they were in the custody of the state. And so then that's why the facilities were run by state agencies, and a lot of times they're outside of New York City. So the Close to Home legislation gave New York City the authority to have a whole continuum of community-based services and residential programs in New York City. And so with the Close to Home legislation, New York City was able to kind of create programs in the city. And so now young people who are convicted in family court of a juvenile delinquency offense, they can go to an alternative program in the city, but then they can also, if a judge feels they have to be removed from their home, they can go to a residential program in the city rather than being sent to a state facility. And these residential programs are much smaller than the programs, than the youth prisons that were, upstate. And so that's also helped further the, sort of decline of the youth prison system in New York.
Great. We have a number of questions from our participants, and I want to give Nell an opportunity to either just make some, if you wanted to add any thoughts before I go to the questions. I want to encourage those who are listening to ask questions through the chat. Also, you can tweet using hashtag law at margins. And if you do have a video device, I can actually invite you to ask the question directly. And so please do. We're going to wind down around 1:15 because we have a very hard close at 1:30. So please ask your questions now. So a couple of the questions. So before I start, so Nell, if you wanted to add some thoughts before we go to the Q&A.
Well, I wanted to answer your question. Now that we're down 50%, now that we've seen the successes that Mishi has talked about, is it still as urgent as it was? And I would argue that it's more urgent for a few reasons. On a practical level, although we've cut the population in half, that's only brought it back roughly to where it was in the 1980s when we invented the super predator and began this massive growth of these institutions. So it's down from an inflated number. We are also still the greatest incarcerator of children in the world by a factor of anything from 7 to 100. So we're still miles away from what other countries are doing. We're still the only country that incarcerates as many kids as we do. The other thing is, we have seen a 50% drop in the population of youth prisons with no increase in juvenile crime. So that's yet another piece of evidence that these institutions are doing zero to keep us safe. They're bleeding money, they're bleeding kids, but they're not keeping us safe. And I think that this sort of hypocrisy has been highlighted by the fact that we've exposed so much abuse and wrongdoing, closed so many facilities, kind of laid on the table the failure of this model, and yet we are continuing to use it. And again, as Mishi pointed out, we're continuing to use it for kids who have done serious things, but still mainly, and I agree with her that that distinction is overused, but we're still locking poor kids of color up for really minor offenses. But the most important reason I think that we need to retain our sense of urgency is, you know, I reported my book by going into as many of these places as I could and talking to the kids, and of course Gladys was wonderful, and I got more access in New York than anywhere in the country. The worst places were more difficult to access. But if you're a kid and your one and only life is ticking away in one of these places, it's infinitely important that you be given a chance to change whatever you need to change, to grow, and to reach a successful adulthood. And incarceration thwarts all those things. And if it's not okay for 100 kids, it's not okay for 50 kids.
Yeah. I also wanted to sort of answer your question too, because I realized I hadn't answered it, and I agree with Nell 100%. I think that there is, there's increased urgency now, and I think another reason why, which, and I think is for me, and I think for many people who are trying to close youth prisons, the biggest reason is because what we've seen as youth incarceration has decreased. What's happened is actually the disproportionate incarceration of youth of color has actually increased. And so as the numbers have gone down, we see more of youth of color even more overrepresented now in youth prisons than they were, 20 years ago. And so and the numbers are shocking. They're really shocking. I mean, I talked about New York City, but if you go into a youth detention center in New York City, like a pretrial detention center, if you go to Rikers Island, you will not see one single white face. Every single person you will see will be a young person of color. So people talk about disproportionate confinement, but it's actually, in some places, it's exclusive confinement of youth of color. And that's really true in many cities around the country. And what's happened is that, as I said, the racial disparities have increased. And so like now we see places like New Jersey where African American youth, the incarceration rate is 26 times greater than the incarceration rate of white youth in New Jersey. In Connecticut, it's 18 times greater for African American youth than white youth. In New Hampshire, it's like, there's only like 2% of the population is youth of color in African American in New Hampshire, but they make up 25% of the young people incarcerated. So it's a 36 times greater incarceration rate for black youth than white youth in New Hampshire. And so we see the racial disparities increasing as the numbers are decreasing, which I think also points to the fact that we really, as the population has decreased, we haven't seen the money reinvested back into communities of color. And so one of the main goals of the Youth First Initiative and a lot of groups working on this issue around the country is to see true justice reinvestment. So as we close these large youth prisons, we want to make sure that that money is redirected back into the communities that are most impacted by youth incarceration, and that hasn't happened yet. States that have closed facilities, for the most part, that money has not gone to communities and has not gone to serve young people and their families in their neighborhoods.
Right, so let's shift now to, we have a number of questions, and I'm going to group them. And so there is a group of questions that are about the sort of the data that even though there's a drop of prisons, are we seeing the juveniles sent increasingly to adult prisons? Do we see an increase in in-school arrests? And that's kind of one grouping of questions. And then there's another grouping of questions that speak to the alternatives. I mean, what do the panelists think about detentions or court-supervised programs as an alternative? And there's a number of advocates that are listening who oftentimes suggest that. So those are the questions. And again, I want to encourage participants to ask their questions. We're going to start winding down at 1/4 after. So, so please pose the questions via chat. So the statistical questions, I don't know if Mishi wants to address that.
Sure.
And then now.
So yeah, so the good news is that so as the number of young people in juvenile youth prisons has declined, the number of young people in adult prisons has also decreased. So there has been a lot of progress, not only in reducing youth incarceration over the last 15 years, just in the past 5 or like 7 years or so, states have started to roll back a lot of the regressive sort of legislation you saw in the 1990s. Were in the 90s with the super predator sort of myth that Nell referred to. We saw a lot of states starting to move young people into the adult system. Now that's starting to change, and states have changed legislation to bring more young people out of the adult system back into the youth system. So you've seen many states raise their age of criminal responsibility: Connecticut, Massachusetts, Illinois, New Hampshire. So a lot of states have raised the age. New York still hasn't. That's a huge issue here in New York. But so the good news is the number of young people in adult facilities has decreased as the number of young people in youth facilities has decreased. So there has been, and it's actually been even a greater decline in young people in adult prisons. There's still over 1,000 young people in adult prisons around the country, and that's a huge issue where youth are even more vulnerable to abuse, sexual abuse, other types of abuse in adult prisons. And so, but I think it is actually, in terms of ending the incarceration of youth in youth prisons, I think that's further down the road. But ending the incarceration of youth in adult prisons, I think, is something that we can achieve even in the next few years. I think it's very achievable. And then, and so I'll stop there, and then Nell, if you have something to add to that.
So I'll tackle this second set of questions, which I think had to do with the utility of court-run alternatives. Is that right?
Yes.
It's a tricky question, because I think, sure, it's better to be on an ankle bracelet or go to a day reporting center than to be incarcerated. At the same time, when you think about what Mishi pointed out about our complete inability to budge what we call racial disparities, that's not a word I like to use. I think that's too neutral and weak a word for what she was describing, despite how many blue ribbon commissions do we have on this? How many reports do we have on this? So we still have an issue when one group of kids, as I said earlier, is dealing with their adolescentness in the context of their family, and another group of kids defined by race and class, that job is given to the court and to public systems. I think in terms of pure human suffering, there's going to be less of it, but I do think that we have to be really careful when we use a word like community-based alternative. Is a government-run day reporting center a community-based alternative? Is close to home, much as I admire the program the same as at home, wouldn't be for my kids. So it's tricky. And the other word that I've been thinking about a lot is reinvestment, because again, as Mishi pointed out, the idea that the money being saved would go into the communities whose children were generating the funding for the jobs. There's sort of the word reinvestment implies that we have been investing in kids when we spend $100,000 or $200,000 or $300,000 to incarcerate them. We've never been investing in kids. We've been investing in institutions, and that's why there's such a such pushback when we try to close institutions. So I think that we may be talking about lesser evils. We may be talking about the best thing for some kids, but as we move away from juvenile prisons, I think we still have to be rigorous in thinking about what a big decision it is to hand control over a child from the family to the state.
No, that's a really important point, and so I also wanted to just wanted to add on that. So like so Youth First is really promoting community-based alternatives, and so as Nell said, I think there's a real misunderstanding of what are community-based alternatives. Some people think that probation and electronic monitoring and those type of programs are community-based because those young people are not in prison, so they're in the community. But when we talk about community-based alternatives, we're really talking about programs that are really rooted in communities, that are run by folks from those communities, that are really based on the principles of positive youth development. And so the ideas of connecting young people to opportunities and positive relationships. And so there's some good examples of that. There's not enough, and so we're trying to really sort of highlight those examples of true community-based alternatives. There's an organization called the Youth Advocate Program, YAP, that's working with young people in several states, and they actually hire people from the neighborhood to be what they call advocates for the youth, who are sort of mentors, but then also link young people with supports and services that they and work with the whole family. And it's a very holistic model, and it's very rooted in the idea of youth development. And I'm on the board of an organization in the Bronx called Community Connections for Youth, which I think is a great model of truly indigenous, community-based leadership, and really, so the idea is that folks in that community, in the South Bronx, are there to support and mentor young people, and really having young people connect with those resources in their neighborhoods, and really building on the leadership of the young people who've been through the system, and people who've a lot of the mentors that they employ are people who've been through the system, and those mentors work with young people, the young people who are in their program. And so those type of programs are the ones that we'd like to see expanded. It's difficult because the state doesn't want to give up control, and they want if the kids aren't going to be locked up in a facility, they still want to be able to control those youth, and they don't want to have hand that over. And so it's definitely, so that is a big piece of the transformation that we'd like to see happen, is not only shifting young people out of facilities back into communities, but really having the communities themselves sort of develop and run the programs.
I want to shift now. We have just a few minutes. Part of Law at the Margins' purpose is inquiry and then to involve. And I'm really very heartened to see that among the participants, we have truly interdisciplinary. We have folks who are working the community level, advocates, lawyers, professors, academicians, looking at this issue. And so, and some good questions around a community-based alternative that is tied to our criminal legal system, or one that's truly outside of that system. So I thought if each of you can sort of close or end with some thoughts of what do we need to do next? We have a group that's listening that are engaged participants. So it seems like we actually have a wonderful opportunity to figure out, what could we do collectively? And of course, Law at the Margins would like to facilitate that process. But what could we do next moving forward? And I know Youth First has some very concrete campaigns, and I don't know if you wanted to take this opportunity to give a call to action. But I'd like to end with ways in which we can sort of move this conversation from today forward as we kind of wind down this webinar. So maybe, yeah.
Sure. So I'm happy to go first. So as you said, so Youth First we do have active campaigns in states, and we'd love to connect with people who are interested in supporting those campaigns. And we also, people should feel free to contact me and discuss ways that you could plug in those states. I mean, each of the states are working on sort of legislative efforts to roll back punitive legislation that allows young people to go, that requires in some cases young people to go into youth prisons, and we're also working on campaigns to sort of raise public awareness around these issues. And so it'd be great to sort of connect with folks who are interested in supporting the campaigns that we have specifically in states. We also have a national call to action, a national petition that's available that people can sign on the website. The idea is that we want to close not only close youth prisons, but we want to, as we've been talking about, really create sort of a true continuum of community-based options for young people. And so I think it's really important that we have people who are willing to sort of share and sort of expand that vision, because I think it's something that it's hard for people to wrap their minds around what we're talking about when we're talking about community-based programs for young people. And so yeah, I definitely would love to connect with people. As I mentioned, we're working in 5 states now. We're planning to expand to 15 states. So if people have ideas, if they're from other states that they would be interested in partnering with us, we'd love to talk to you about that as well. We're putting together a toolkit also for the states we're not able to work in. We'd love to be able to support advocates and organizers in those states who are putting together information about people who are interested in doing campaigns in their states as well. So I'd love to connect with folks about that too.
Great. Before I invite Nell, there are a couple of questions that are coming up regarding the link between juvenile prisons and increasing arrest in the school. So the school to prison pipeline and prison. And in fact, this webinar was conceived as seeing them as interlinked. Right. And so while the prison population is decreasing, advocates are, who are listening are sharing that there's increased school arrests. And so could you speak to that question? And then the other, again, maybe as a closing, is what are the challenges to a community-based model not linked to criminal justice, because very few people are willing to be mentors. What supports do youth really have when they come home? So do we have the infrastructure to actually, in fact, create a truly community-based model? So those are the questions, and I just want to be mindful of our time. So maybe incorporating the answers as part of your closing. And I just want to highlight that at Law at the Margins event page, we're going to continue to populate information from after the webinar. So there'll be ample opportunity to kind of continue the dialogue. But so Nell, if you want to tackle one or part or pieces.
Yeah, so part of the question was about school-based arrests. Yep. And the second part of the question
was really the challenges of this community-based model that it seems like we're all proposing, but when young people go back home, they may not have mentors. There's not sufficient support structures for them. So how do we actually make this model work?
Yeah, and I think those questions are very interrelated, because I deeply admire the kinds of programs that Mishi was talking about, but at the very bottom line, kids don't need programs, they need families. And I think, again, there's just this kind of profound, unspoken disrespect for the communities that the kids come from. And I think the schools couldn't be a better example. If we didn't have segregated, separate, and unequal schools, we wouldn't have the problem that we're talking about today. If we invested in every child's education equally, we wouldn't have police in the schools. So I feel like there's so many things that are tangled up in the critique of this single institution. What is the challenge to genuinely investing in the communities that kids come from? I think it's the same mindset that has, again, allowed the racial injustice to get worse as the larger situation has gotten better, and also a profound aversion to giving money directly to poor people. We'll do almost anything to avoid that. One of the most profound studies that I saw looked at a family that was getting multiple services, and the researchers instead gave that family the money. And the families in the group that were getting the money did much better than those that were being, sort of barraged with services. So I think until we think about, we know that poor kids of color are being arrested in their schools. We know that they're still going to the deep end institutions. So I think until we can really think about what, not reinvesting in those neighborhoods, but in investing in them, we're going to be fixing. And I know that it's also very easy for me to say that. I'm not doing the work that Mishi is of actually trying to move a system. It's much easier as a writer to just say, well, we should do this and we should do this. But I think that the bottom line problem comes down to how the larger society sees the kids or doesn't see them. And if there were one call to action I'd want to leave people with, it would be to find a way to know the kids that we're talking about, or if you already do, to help the rest of the world know them. Because until we do know them, I think we're not gonna do right by them.
Great, then. Thanks. Actually, it's a wonderful point for me to mention that those of you who are listening, really use Law at the Margins as a site to share your work, and that's intended for this platform. And I want to thank Devontae Lewis from Community Connections for Youth. Mishi mentioned them. They're based in South Bronx. They're youth leaders directing the policies for juvenile justice that impacts them. And he has a piece on lawatthemargins.com. I think lifting up those stories, and definitely Law at the Margins can be a site for that. So we have just few minutes left. I don't know if Mishi wants to make any concluding remarks. And I want to thank everyone who have been asking questions and participating, reminding you that, again, on Facebook, Law at the Margins, you can pose and share information as well. So Mishi, do you want to make some concluding remarks before we sort of close the webinar?
I mean, it's hard to follow Nell because she said it all. I mean, just to echo what she said, I think that the question around school-based arrest, I think it's really two sides of the same coin, right? It's just that we have two systems of justice in our country, and just like two systems of education, and so just how we have a juvenile justice system that works. It's the system that's already in place for white middle-class youth. Like, those kids don't go through the court system. They don't go through youth prisons. There's immediately, if they get in trouble, there's supports that are put in place for them. They get the help that they need, and so. And it's similarly with white middle class or upper class students in schools, right? You don't see police in those schools, and you don't see the sort of zero tolerance and the other things that you see with where students and predominantly where the student body is predominantly students of color. And so there is a much bigger this effort that we're doing at Youth First around trying to close youth prisons, we really do know that there's a much larger struggle around racial justice, and so it's all intertwined, and we can't, we won't be able to close youth prisons or really invest, not even reinvest, but invest in communities of color unless we really take on this larger issue of racial injustice in our society. And so it's even I feel like closing youth prisons is obviously we've set a pretty high bar for ourselves, but we recognize that it's completely connected for all connected to all the work that people have been doing, and particularly in the last 2 years, where it's really come to the fore of this issue of of racial justice. And so I think it's really important that people do think of this as a movement, and that really kind of connect this issue with the other issues that are all a part of the same thing. And so so I think it's great that folks who are working on school discipline issues, and people are working on juvenile justice issues, and people are working on policing issues. It's really important for for folks to connect and try to work together on this.
Great. So thank you so much. I'd like to thank Nell Bernstein for writing the book. That really kind of was the impetus for me to think about provocatively about dismantling and ending youth prisons. And Mishi Faruqee who I count a dear friend and have been in this movement for a long time on the ground, for participating. I do also want to thank all of the participants who have been chatting. We have folks from professors to organizers and to students, and so it's really the intent of Law at the Margins to create this interdisciplinary collaborative space. I want to thank LB Garcia, who's sort of the behind-the-scenes person on these webinars. And then finally, Val Merlina, who's a second-year law student at UPitt and has been tweeting at Law at the Margins. And then finally, again, I do want to encourage those who are listening to see Law at the Margins as a platform to lift up the work that you're doing. Let me know what we could do to continue and move towards our aspiration to end youth prisons. And I think that Nell's statement around we need to invest in kids, not invest in institutions, I think is a powerful one. And the reminder that when we talk about criminal justice, invariably we're also talking about profound structural and embedded racial injustice that permeates not just in prisons, but how we educate young people, how we treat young people. And so for that, I want to thank all of you and take care.
Thank you.